Mary Anderson stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her penthouse office, gazing out at the twinkling lights of Los Angeles. At 55, she was the picture of success, impeccably dressed in a tailored Chanel suit. Not a strand of her expertly highlighted hair out of place. The Anderson Hotel empire was her kingdom, and from this lofty perch she ruled it with an iron fist. But as the clock struck 9 p.m. and her employees filtered out of the building below, Mary felt the familiar ache of loneliness creep in. The empire she'd built alongside her late husband, Robert, suddenly felt hollow. "Oh, Robert," she whispered, her manicured hand resting on the cool glass. "What would you think of me now?" Her eyes drifted to the single-framed photo on her otherwise stark desk, a younger version of herself, Robert, and their son John, all smiles on a beach in Hawaii. It was the last vacation they'd taken as a family before everything fell apart. John. The thought of her estranged son sent a sharp pain through Mary's chest. Where was he now? Was he safe? Happy? It had been 10 years since that fateful night when she'd told him to leave and never come back. 10 years of sleepless nights, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. As Mary sank into her plush leather chair, memories flooded her mind. Robert Anderson had been a force of nature, charming, ambitious, and utterly devoted to building his hotel empire. Mary had fallen head over heels for him at a charity gala, captivated by his dazzling smile and big dreams. Their whirlwind romance led to a fairy tale wedding, and within a year, Mary was pregnant with John. As she watched her husband cut the ribbon at the grand opening of their first hotel, her hand resting on her swollen belly, Mary had never felt more alive. The years that followed were a blur of success and excess. The Anderson Hotel empire grew exponentially, with properties popping up in every major city across the country. John grew up in the lap of luxury, wanting for nothing. But as the empire expanded, so did the distance between Mary and her family. Robert threw himself into work, leaving Mary to raise John largely on her own. And John, burdened by the weight of his parents' expectations, began to rebel. It started small skipping classes, talking back to teachers. But as John entered his teenage years, his behavior spiraled out of control. Partying, drugs, run-ins with the law, each incident a cry for attention that Mary and Robert were too busy to hear. The breaking point came on John's 18th birthday. Mary and Robert had planned an extravagant party at their Beverly Hills mansion, inviting the who's who of Los Angeles society. But John had other plans. "I'm not going to your stupid party," John had shouted, his words slurring slightly from whatever he'd been drinking. "I'm sick of being your perfect little puppet." Robert's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "You ungrateful little brat. After everything we've given you." "Given me?" John laughed bitterly. "You've given me everything except what I actually needed. Parents who gave a damn." The argument escalated, voices rising until they echoed through the marble halls of the mansion. Mary stood frozen, watching in horror as her husband and son hurled years of pent-up resentment at each other. And then, in a moment that would haunt Mary's nightmares for years to come, Robert clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain. As he crumpled to the floor, John's anger gave way to panic. "Dad! Dad!" John cried, dropping to his knees beside his father. But it was too late. By the time the ambulance arrived, Robert Anderson was gone, felled by a massive heart attack at the age of 50. In the chaos that followed, Mary's grief twisted into rage. She turned on John, her voice cold and unforgiving. "This is your fault," she hissed. "If you hadn't been so selfish, so ungrateful, get out and don't ever come back." The look of devastation on John's face as he fled into the night would be seared into Mary's memory forever. It was only after he was gone that the weight of what she'd done came crashing down on her. But pride and grief are powerful forces, and in the years that followed, Mary threw herself into the only thing she had left, the hotel empire she and Robert had built. She became known as the Ice Queen of the hospitality world, her ruthless business acumen matched only by her cold demeanor. And all the while, the hole in her heart where her family should have been grew larger and larger. Mary's trip down memory lane was interrupted by the shrill ring of her office phone. Glancing at the clock, 10:23 p.m., she frowned. Who would be calling at this hour? Mary Anderson, she answered crisply. Mrs. Anderson? A hesitant female voice came through the line. My name is Nicole Harper. I'm calling about your son, John. Mary's heart leapt into her throat. John? What about him? Is he all right? There was a pause, filled only by the sound of Nicole's shaky breathing. Mrs. Anderson, John's in the hospital. He's in critical condition. The doctors say... Nicole's voice broke. They say he might not make it through the night. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mary gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white. Where? She managed to choke out. Where is he? St. Francis Memorial Hospital in Bakersfield, Nicole replied. Please, Mrs. Anderson, he needs you. Without another word, Mary slammed down the phone and bolted for the door. Her Louboutin heels clacked against the marble floor as she ran to the elevator, her mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. As she peeled out of the parking garage in her Mercedes, Mary's only thought was of her son. Hold on, John, she whispered, pushing the accelerator to the floor. Mommy's coming. The 118 freeway stretched out before Mary like a ribbon of darkness, punctuated only by the occasional glare of oncoming headlights. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached, but she barely noticed. Every fiber of her being was focused on getting to John. As she flew past familiar landmarks, the San Fernando Valley giving way to the rugged terrain of the Los Padres National Forest, Mary's mind raced even faster than her car. What had happened to John? How long had he been in Bakersfield? And who was this Nicole person? The questions swirled in her mind, each one bringing a fresh wave of guilt and fear. I should have looked for him, Mary muttered, blinking back tears. I should have tried harder to make things right. The what-ifs and should-haves threatened to overwhelm her, but Mary pushed them aside. There would be time for regrets later. Right now, John needed her, and this time she wouldn't let him down. As the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky, Mary finally saw the sign she'd been praying for. Bakersfield city limits. Her GPS chirped, directing her to St. Francis Memorial Hospital. Screeching into the parking lot, Mary barely remembered to put the car in park before she was out and running towards the emergency room entrance. The automatic doors whooshed open, and she burst into the fluorescent-lit waiting area. My son, she gasped to the startled receptionist. John Anderson, where is he? The young woman behind the desk blinked in surprise. Ma'am, visiting hours don't start until... I don't give a damn about visiting hours. Mary's voice rose, drawing the attention of a nearby security guard. My son is dying. Now tell me where he is. A gentle hand on her arm made Mary whirl around, ready to unleash her fury on whoever dared to stop her. But the compassionate eyes of a middle-aged nurse stopped her in her tracks. Mrs. Anderson? The nurse asked softly. At Mary's nod, she continued. I'm Nurse Chen. I've been taking care of John. Come with me, please. As they hurried down the sterile hospital corridors, Nurse Chen filled Mary in on John's condition. He was brought in last night with severe head trauma. The doctors have been working to reduce the swelling in his brain, but... She hesitated. It's touch and go right now. Mary's heart clenched. How did this happen? Nurse Chen's expression softened. From what we've been able to piece together, John was involved in an altercation about a year ago. He was defending a young woman from some harassers. He took a bad blow to the head but refused to stay in the hospital for treatment. It seems the injury was more severe than anyone realized. They stopped outside a room at the end of the hall. Mrs. Anderson, Nurse Chen said gently, I need to prepare you. John's condition is very serious. He's on life support and he may not look like the son you remember. Mary squared her shoulders, steeling herself for what lay beyond the door. I understand. Please, let me see my boy. As the door swung open, Mary's breath caught in her throat. There, surrounded by beeping machines and tangled in a web of tubes and wires, lay John. His face was swollen and bruised, a stark contrast to the peaceful expression he wore. Oh, John, Mary whispered, rushing to his bedside. She took his hand, so much larger than she remembered, yet still unmistakably her little boy's. Mommy's here, sweetheart. I'm here now. As Mary sank into the chair beside John's bed, the weight of the past 10 years crashed down upon her. Tears flowed freely as she stroked her son's hand, murmuring apologies and promises. "I'm so sorry, John," she sobbed. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I let my pride and anger keep us apart. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Do you hear me? You fight, John. You fight to come back to me." As the morning sun began to filter through the hospital room's thin curtains, Mary made a silent vow. No matter what it took, she would make things right. She would be the mother John deserved, the mother she should have been all along. Little did she know, the road to redemption would be far more complicated and far more rewarding than she could have ever imagined. Mary had been at John's bedside for hours, alternating between quiet pleas for him to wake up and fierce demands that the doctors do more, when she spotted a young woman hovering in the doorway. She was petite, with long brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her clothes were wrinkled, as if she'd slept in them, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. But what caught Mary's attention was the gentle swell of the girl's belly, visible beneath her oversized sweater. "You must be Nicole," Mary said, her voice hoarse from hours of talking to John. The girl nodded, taking a tentative step into the room. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself earlier. I didn't want to intrude." Mary's eyes narrowed. "You're the one who called me, aren't you? How do you know my son?" Nicole's hand moved protectively to her stomach. "John and we're together. This is his baby." The words hit Mary like a physical blow. A baby? Her John? A father? She looked at the unconscious man in the hospital bed, trying to reconcile the image of her rebellious teenage son with the idea of impending fatherhood. "I think," Mary said slowly, "that you and I need to have a talk." They retreated to the small waiting area at the end of the hall, both women eyeing each other warily. Mary took in Nicole's appearance more closely, the worn sneakers, the faded jeans. This girl was a far cry from the society debutantes she'd always imagined John would end up with. "How did you meet my son?" Mary asked, unable to keep a hint of judgment from her voice. Nicole's chin lifted defiantly. "At a diner where I was waitressing. Some drunk jerks were hassling me and John stepped in. He took a pretty bad beating, but he saved me." Her voice softened. "He was my hero that night." Mary's heart clenched. That sounded like the John she remembered, always ready to fight for the underdog, even at his own expense. "And the baby?" she pressed. Nicole's hand returned to her belly. "It wasn't planned, but we're happy about it. John's been so excited. He's been working 2 jobs to save up for the baby, taking night classes to finish his degree. He wanted—" Her voice broke. "He wanted to make you proud." The weight of Nicole's words settled over Mary like a heavy blanket. All this time she'd imagined John living some wild, reckless life, but the reality was so much more complex and so much more heartbreaking. "Mrs. Anderson," Nicole said, her eyes filling with tears, "I know you and John have had your differences, but he loves you so much. He talks about you all the time, about how he wishes he could make things right." Mary felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. "I've made so many mistakes," she whispered. "I don't know if he can ever forgive me." Nicole reached out, taking Mary's hand in her own. "He already has. Now you just need to forgive yourself." As the 2 women sat there, united in their love for John and their fear for his future, Mary felt something shift inside her. This girl, this stranger who was carrying her grandchild, had shown her more compassion in a few minutes than Mary had shown anyone in years. "Tell me," Mary said softly. "Tell me everything about my son's life. I want to know it all." And as Nicole began to speak, painting a picture of the man John had become, Mary allowed herself to hope. Hope that it wasn't too late. Hope that she could be the mother and grandmother that her family deserved. As night fell once again, Mary found herself back at John's bedside, this time with Nicole curled up in a chair nearby. The steady beep of the heart monitor was both comforting and terrifying, a constant reminder that John was still with them, but only just. Mary's mind whirled with everything Nicole had told her. John had been living in Bakersfield for the past 5 years, working odd jobs, and slowly piecing his life back together. He'd gotten his GED, enrolled in community college, and was on track to graduate with a degree in social work. He wants to help kids who are struggling, Nicole had explained. He says he knows what it's like to feel lost and alone. The irony wasn't lost on Mary. Her son, whom she'd labeled a hopeless case, was dedicating his life to helping others find hope. As she watched John's chest rise and fall with each mechanical breath, Mary's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. A tall man in a white coat burst into the room, flanked by several nurses. "Mrs. Anderson?" the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Knight. I understand you requested a consultation?" Mary stood, shaking the doctor's hand firmly. "Yes, thank you for coming so quickly. What can you tell me about my son's condition?" Dr. Knight's face was grave as he explained the extent of John's injuries. The blow to his head a year ago had caused a slow bleed in his brain, which had finally reached a critical point. The local doctors had done what they could, but John needed specialized neurosurgery if he was to have any chance of recovery. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Anderson," Dr. Knight said, his voice gentle but firm. "The surgery is risky. There's a chance John might not survive it, but without it, he will certainly die." Mary felt Nicole's hand slip into hers, squeezing tightly. She looked at the young woman who loved her son, who was carrying his child. Then she looked at John, so still and pale in the hospital bed. In that moment, Mary Anderson made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "Do it," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, save my son." Dr. Knight nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "We'll prep him for surgery immediately. It's going to be a long night, Mrs. Anderson. I suggest you both try to get some rest." But rest was the furthest thing from Mary's mind as she watched them wheel John away to the operating room. As the doors swung shut behind him, she turned to Nicole. "Come on," she said, her voice softer than it had been in years. "Let's get you something to eat. That baby needs nourishment, and I'd like to hear more about my grandchild." As they made their way to the hospital cafeteria, Mary found herself opening up to Nicole in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. She told her about John's childhood, about the good times before the family had been torn apart by ambition and misunderstanding. "He was such a happy little boy," Mary said, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "Always laughing, always curious about everything. I remember this one time, he must have been about 5, he decided he wanted to redecorate the lobby of our first hotel. Robert and I came down to find him finger painting all over the marble floors." Nicole laughed, a sound that warmed Mary's heart. "That sounds like John. He's always talking about how he wants to paint the nursery himself." As the hours ticked by, Mary and Nicole shared stories, fears, and tentative hopes for the future. By the time Dr. Knight reappeared, looking exhausted but cautiously optimistic, the two women had formed a bond that would prove unbreakable in the days to come. "He made it through the surgery," Dr. Knight announced, causing both women to sag with relief. "The next 24 hours will be critical, but I'm hopeful. John's a fighter." "You have no idea," Mary murmured, thinking of all her son had overcome. As they were allowed back into John's room, Mary was struck by how young and vulnerable he looked. The machines were still there, but somehow there was a peace about him that hadn't been there before. Taking her place by his bedside, Mary took John's hand in hers. "You listen to me, John Anderson," she said, her voice fierce with love and determination. "You've got a whole life waiting for you out here. A baby on the way, a girl who loves you, and a mother who's so sorry and who loves you more than you could ever know. So you fight, you hear me? You fight to come back to us." As if in response, John's fingers twitched slightly in Mary's grasp. The next few days passed in a blur of coffee runs, hushed conversations with doctors, and long hours spent willing John to open his eyes. Mary barely left the hospital, sending her assistant to fetch fresh clothes and running the Hotel Empire from her phone between vigils at John's bedside. Nicole, too, became a constant presence, her quiet strength a balm to Mary's frayed nerves. As they waited and hoped, the two women began to plan for a future they both prayed would come to pass. We'll need to child-proof the penthouse, Mary mused one afternoon, surprising herself with how easily she'd begun to include John and Nicole in her vision of the future. And of course, you'll both move in with me, at least until you find a place of your own. Nicole looked up from the baby name book she'd been flipping through, her eyes wide. Mrs. Anderson, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't possibly— Nonsense, Mary cut her off, waving a hand dismissively. And for goodness sake, call me Mary. We're family now. The word family hung in the air between them, full of promise and healing. Nicole's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, a smile breaking across her face. It was late that night, as Mary dozed in the uncomfortable hospital chair, that she felt it. A slight pressure on her hand. Her eyes flew open, focusing immediately on John's face. "John?" she whispered, hardly daring to hope. "John, can you hear me?" For a heart-stopping moment there was no response. Then, slowly, John's eyelids began to flutter. Mary held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, like a miracle, John's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, clouded with confusion and pain, but as they settled on Mary's face, a flicker of recognition passed through them. "Mom?" John's voice was barely audible, rough from disuse and the breathing tube that had only recently been removed. Mary couldn't hold back the sob that escaped her. "Yes, sweetheart, it's Mom. I'm here. I'm right here." John's brow furrowed, as if he was trying to piece together a complicated puzzle. You came?" The simple question broke Mary's heart all over again. "Of course I came," she said, stroking his cheek gently. "I'm so sorry, John. I'm sorry for everything. Can you ever forgive me?" A ghost of a smile played on John's lips. "Already you have," he managed to whisper before his eyes began to droop again. "Rest now," Mary soothed, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I'll be right here when you wake up, I promise." As John drifted back to sleep, Mary felt a presence behind her. She turned to see Nicole standing in the doorway, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "He woke up," Mary said, her voice filled with wonder. "He's going to be okay." Nicole crossed the room, wrapping Mary in a tight hug. "We're all going to be okay," she whispered, and for the first time in 10 long years, Mary believed it. The weeks that followed were filled with grueling physical therapy sessions, emotional conversations, and tentative steps towards healing, both physical and emotional. John grew stronger every day, his determination to recover matched only by his family's unwavering support. Mary threw herself into her new roles as doting mother and soon-to-be grandmother, with a passion that surprised everyone, especially herself. She attended every doctor's appointment, both for John and for Nicole's pregnancy. She redecorated the penthouse, turning one of the guest rooms into a nursery that would have made interior design magazines weep with envy. But more importantly, she listened. She listened as John poured out years of pain and resentment, of loneliness and regret. She listened as he spoke of his dreams for the future, of his desire to make a difference in the world. And with each word, each shared moment, the chasm between them began to close. It wasn't always easy. There were arguments, misunderstandings, moments when old hurts threatened to resurface. But this time, instead of running from the conflict, they faced it head-on, together. One evening, as they sat on the terrace of Mary's penthouse watching the sun set over the Los Angeles skyline, John turned to his mother with a serious expression. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, "I want you to know, I don't blame you for what happened with Dad. I know now that it wasn't anyone's fault. It was just a terrible tragedy." Mary felt tears prick at her eyes. "Oh, John, I've carried that guilt for so long. I thought you hated me." John shook his head, reaching out to take her hand. "I could never hate you, Mom. I was angry, yes, hurt, but I always loved you. Always." As they embraced, Mary felt the last of her walls crumble. This was what she'd been missing all these years, the unconditional love of family. The moment was interrupted by a startled gasp from Nicole, who had been quietly reading nearby. Both Mary and John turned to her in alarm. "Nicole? What is it? Is it the baby?" John asked, panic edging his voice. But Nicole was smiling, her hands pressed to her belly. No, it's okay. The baby just kicked. Here, feel. She grabbed John's hand, placing it on her stomach. His eyes widened in wonder as he felt the tiny flutter of movement beneath his palm. Mom, he said, his voice filled with awe. Come here. Come feel your grandchild. As Mary placed her hand next to John's, feeling the miracle of new life stirring beneath her touch, she was overwhelmed by a sense of rightness. This was her family. Imperfect, unexpected, but perfectly, wonderfully theirs. You know, she said, a mischievous glint in her eye, I think it's time we expanded the Anderson Hotel empire. How does Anderson Family Resorts sound? Places where families can come to reconnect, to heal, to make new memories. John looked at her in surprise. You'd want me involved in the business? Mary nodded. Not just involved, John. I want you to lead it. You and Nicole both. Your social work background, your compassion. That's exactly what this new venture needs. As John and Nicole exchanged excited glances, already beginning to brainstorm ideas, Mary felt a peace settle over her. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was bright with possibility. 1 year later, Mary stood in the grand ballroom of the newest Anderson Family Resort, watching as guests milled about, champagne flutes in hand. The grand opening gala was in full swing, a celebration not just of a new business venture, but of a family reborn. Her eyes found John across the room, bouncing their 6-month-old granddaughter Lily in his arms as he chatted with investors. Nicole stood by his side, her hand resting comfortably on his back, looking radiant in a gown that Mary had insisted on buying for her. As if sensing her gaze, John looked up, meeting his mother's eyes. He smiled, that same bright, happy smile she remembered from his childhood, and Mary felt her heart swell with love and pride. She made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from the city's elite, but her focus was solely on her family. There's my girl, Mary cooed as she reached them, holding out her arms for Lily. The baby gurgled happily, reaching for her grandmother with chubby hands. Mom, this is incredible, John said, gesturing to the opulent surroundings. I can't believe how quickly you pulled all this together. Mary smiled, bouncing Lily gently. Well, I had some pretty amazing help. This is your vision too, you know. Both of you, she added, including Nicole in her proud gaze. As they stood there, a perfect picture of family unity, Mary couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From broken hearts and shattered dreams to this, a new beginning, a second chance at the life they all deserved. You know, she said softly, your father would be so proud of you, John. Of all of us. John's eyes misted over as he nodded. I like to think he's watching over us, he said, that he knows how far we've come. Just then the opening notes of a familiar song began to play, the same song that had played during Mary and Robert's first dance at their wedding, all those years ago. May I have this dance, Mom? John asked, holding out his hand with a smile. As Mary handed Lily to Nicole and stepped onto the dance floor with her son, she felt a sense of completion wash over her. The past and present, joy and sorrow, all woven together into the beautiful tapestry of their lives. And as they swayed to the music, surrounded by the love and warmth of their family and friends, Mary knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because that's what families do. They love, they forgive, and they hold on tight to the precious gift of each other.